Mystery of the Haunted Widow, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, and thank you for joining me tonight on this journey. If you're joining us for the first time, we invite you to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a mystery. Dim your lights, Poirot yourself a tisane, and prepare to exercise your own grey cells. Chapter 1. The Séance. The candles guttered and died as though snuffed by an invisible hand, plunging the drawing room of Ashworth Manor into absolute darkness. Hercule Poirot sat motionless at the round table, his small hands resting lightly on its polished surface, his keen ears cataloguing every sound in the suddenly lightless room. Around him, he could hear the quickened breathing of the other participants in this evening's séance. The sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Pemberton on his left, the soft whimper of young Miss Cavendish across the table, the muttered oath from Colonel Hastings, not his friend, but a distant relation who shared the surname, somewhere in the darkness to his right. And from the head of the table, where the medium Madame Zelda had been conducting the session with theatrical flourishes and pronouncements from beyond the veil, came a sound that made even Poirot's considerable composure waver. A low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate not from human vocal cords, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere darker, somewhere that had no business intruding upon the affairs of the living. "He comes," Madame Zelda intoned, her voice transformed from its usual theatrical contralto to something hollow and resonant. "The spirit of Sir Edmund Ashworth crosses the threshold between worlds. He has a message for his widow. He demands to be heard." The temperature in the room dropped precipitously. Poirot could feel it, a sudden chill that raised gooseflesh on his arms, despite his immaculate evening jacket. This was no mere theatrical effect, no trick of suggestion or imagination. The cold was real, palpable, penetrating. And then the voice came. "Eleanor." It was a man's voice, deep and commanding, echoing through the darkness as though spoken from the bottom of a well. It was not Madame Zelda's voice, could not have been. The timbre was entirely different, the accent unmistakably that of the English aristocracy rather than the medium's affected continental tones. "Eleanor, you know what you did." A scream pierced the darkness. The voice of Lady Eleanor Ashworth, their hostess, the widow who had arranged this séance in the desperate hope of contacting her late husband. But this was not the scream of a woman receiving a longed-for message from beyond. This was the scream of pure terror, of guilt exposed, of secrets dragged into the light. "No!" Lady Eleanor cried. "Edmund, please! I didn't! It wasn't!" "You killed me!" The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence, and Poirot heard the sound of a chair scraping back, of someone rising in panic, of footsteps stumbling toward the door. There was a crash, someone colliding with furniture in the darkness, and then the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the floor. "Lights!" someone shouted. "For God's sake, someone light the candles!" Poirot had already produced the box of matches he always carried and struck one with practiced efficiency. The small flame illuminated a scene of chaos. Overturned chairs, scattered candles, faces pale with shock and fear. Colonel Hastings was helping Miss Cavendish to her feet. She had apparently fainted and knocked over her chair in falling. Mrs. Pemberton stood pressed against the wall, her hand over her heart, her face the colour of old parchment. Madame Zelda remained seated at the head of the table, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and regular, apparently still in her trance state. She was a striking woman of indeterminate age, with dark hair streaked with silver, and features that spoke of Mediterranean ancestry. Spanish, perhaps, or Italian. Her costume was appropriately theatrical. Flowing robes of purple and gold, heavy rings on every finger, a pendant of amber that caught the matchlight and seemed to glow with inner fire. But it was the figure on the floor that commanded Poirot's attention. Lady Eleanor Ashworth lay crumpled beside the door, her elaborate evening gown pooled around her like a dark lake, her face turned away from the light. She was not moving. "Lady Eleanor!" Poirot was at her side in an instant, his fingers seeking the pulse at her throat. It was there, weak but steady, the heartbeat of a woman who had fainted rather than died. He felt a moment of relief, followed immediately by a surge of professional curiosity. What had she been about to confess when the darkness and the voice had overwhelmed her? What secret lay behind her desperate denial? "She's alive," he announced to the room, merely unconscious. "Colonel Hastings, if you would be so good as to fetch some water and smelling salts. Mrs. Pemberton, please see to Miss Cavendish. She appears to have had quite a shock. And someone," he looked around the room, his green eyes sharp despite the dim light. "Someone should check that all the doors and windows are secure. I do not believe we are alone in this house." The statement produced exactly the effect he had intended. A ripple of fresh fear through the already shaken company, followed by a flurry of activity as his instructions were carried out. In the confusion, Poirot took the opportunity to examine the room more closely, his trained eye seeking any evidence of how the extraordinary events of the past few minutes had been achieved. The candles had been arranged in a circle on the table, as was traditional for séances. All 6 had gone out simultaneously, not guttered down naturally, but extinguished as though by a single breath. Poirot bent to examine the wicks and found them still warm, still bearing traces of molten wax that had not had time to cool. The candles had been burning normally until the moment they were snuffed. The temperature drop was harder to explain. The room's single fireplace contained a healthy blaze, and the windows were shuttered against the December chill. There was no obvious source of cold air, no hidden vent or passage that might have admitted a draught. And yet, the chill had been unmistakable. Poirot could still feel its lingering presence, a coldness that seemed to cling to the very walls. And the voice, that terrible, accusing voice that had spoken Sir Edmund's name and pronounced his widow a murderess. Poirot had attended enough séances in his career to recognize the usual tricks: ventriloquism, speaking tubes, concealed confederates. But this voice had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room with its presence rather than emanating from any single point. It had been, he had to admit, remarkably convincing. Which meant one of two things. Either the supernatural was real, and Sir Edmund Ashworth had indeed returned from the grave to accuse his wife of murder, or someone in this house was a very skilled deceiver, with a very specific agenda. Poirot knew which explanation he preferred. The supernatural made for entertaining stories, but in his experience, the most extraordinary events always had the most mundane explanations. Someone had staged this séance, had arranged the effects, had spoken those terrible words in a voice designed to terrify and accuse. The question was, who? And more importantly, why? Lady Eleanor was beginning to stir, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness returned. Poirot helped her to a sitting position, supporting her with one arm, while Colonel Hastings pressed a glass of water into her trembling hands. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. "Edmund. I heard Edmund." "You heard something, madame." Whether it was truly your late husband remains to be determined. Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. I think perhaps we should postpone any further spiritual investigations until we have had a chance to examine what occurred here tonight.
But he spoke to me. He accused me of...
She broke off, her face crumpling with distress.
It's not true. Whatever you heard, it's not true. I loved Edmund. I would never have harmed him.
No one is making accusations, Lady Eleanor. But I confess that I am curious about what happened here tonight. The effects were most impressive. I should very much like to understand how they were achieved. Lady Eleanor's expression shifted from distress to something more complex, a mixture of fear and hope and desperate calculation.
You are Hercule Poirot, she said. The detective. I had heard you were visiting the area. That's why I invited you tonight. I hoped.
You hoped that I might provide a rational explanation for the phenomena you have been experiencing.
Yes. You see, Monsieur Poirot, this is not the first time. Ever since Edmund died 6 months ago, I have been haunted. Things move in the night. Voices whisper in empty rooms. And sometimes...
She shuddered.
Sometimes I see him. Standing at the foot of my bed, or in the corridor outside my room. He never speaks when I see him, but his eyes are full of accusation.
And tonight's séance was an attempt to communicate with this spirit, to understand what he wants.
I had to know. I had to understand why he won't leave me in peace.
Lady Eleanor's hands clenched around the water glass. Madame Zelda came highly recommended. She has helped others in similar situations, or so I was told. I thought perhaps, if I could speak to Edmund directly, I could explain. I could make him understand. Understand what, Madame? But Lady Eleanor seemed to realize she had said too much. Her expression closed, her jaw setting with determination.
Nothing. There is nothing to understand. I am innocent of any wrongdoing, and I will not be terrorized in my own home by whatever this is.
Poirot studied her face for a long moment, reading the fear and guilt that she was trying so hard to conceal. Lady Eleanor Ashworth was lying. Of that he was certain. Whether she was lying about her innocence or about something else entirely, he could not yet determine. But he was suddenly very interested in learning more about the late Sir Edmund Ashworth, his death 6 months ago, and the secrets that his widow was so desperate to keep hidden.
Lady Eleanor,
he said at last.
I wonder if I might impose upon your hospitality for a few days. The weather has turned, and travel will be difficult until the roads improve. And I confess that I find myself intrigued by the events of this evening. With your permission, I should like to investigate further.
Her eyes widened with something that looked like hope.
You would do that? You would help me? I would seek the truth, madame. Whether that truth helps you or harms you remains to be seen. But I give you my word that I will approach this matter with an open mind and the commitment to justice. Whatever is happening in this house, I intend to discover it.
Lady Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before nodding.
Yes. Yes, please stay. I don't care what you find, Monsieur Poirot. I just want this to end. I want to know the truth, whatever it is. I cannot go on living like this, jumping at shadows, terrified of the dark. If Edmund truly blames me for his death, I need to understand why. And if someone is playing a cruel trick, Her expression hardened. Then I want to know who, and I want them punished. Then we are agreed. I shall begin my investigation tomorrow morning. But first,
Poirot turned to survey the room, where the other guests had reassembled in various states of shock and recovery.
First, I think we should all retire for the evening. It has been a most eventful night.
And I suspect we shall all benefit from rest and reflection. He did not add what he was thinking, that somewhere in this house a killer might be hiding. Because if Lady Eleanor had indeed murdered her husband, then she had motive to stage these supernatural events as a cover for her guilt. And if she had not, if she was truly innocent, then someone else had reason to make her appear guilty. Either way, Poirot was certain of one thing. The mystery of the haunted widow had only just begun. Chapter 2. Ashworth Manor. The morning brought a transformation that seemed almost as miraculous as the previous night's supernatural display. The snow that had threatened during the séance had arrived in earnest, blanketing the countryside in pristine white and rendering the roads entirely impassable. Ashworth Manor, a rambling Gothic pile that had been the seat of the Ashworth family for 3 centuries, now stood isolated in a world of white, its dark stone walls and pointed gables rising from the snow like the illustration from some fairy tale of the more sinister variety. Poirot stood at his bedroom window, surveying the scene with a mixture of appreciation and unease. The isolation was complete. No vehicle could navigate those drifts. No messenger could bring news from the outside world. For the next several days at least, everyone present at last night's séance would remain trapped together within these walls. It was, he reflected, the perfect setting for either a cosy house party or a murder mystery. He suspected it might prove to be the latter. The guest list he had established through discreet inquiries the previous evening was both intimate and suggestive. In addition to Lady Eleanor herself, there were 6 other people staying at Ashworth Manor, each with their own apparent reasons for being there. Colonel Hastings, no relation to Poirot's dear friend, as he had been at pains to establish, was a neighbour whose estate bordered the Ashworth lands. He was a bluff, hearty man of 60-odd years, with a military bearing and a tendency to speak in clipped sentences that suggested long service in India or some other outpost of empire. He had been a friend of Sir Edmund's, he claimed, and had come to offer his support to the widow in her time of grief. But there was something in the way he looked at Lady Eleanor, a hunger carefully concealed beneath solicitude that suggested his motives might be more personal than neighbourly. Mrs. Pemberton was Lady Eleanor's aunt, a formidable woman of advanced years who had taken up residence at Ashworth Manor shortly after Sir Edmund's death. She claimed to be providing comfort and companionship to her bereaved niece, but her sharp eyes and sharper tongue suggested she was more interested in monitoring Lady Eleanor's behaviour than in offering sympathy. She was the sort of elderly relative who made everyone around her feel perpetually guilty, though for what specific sins they could never quite determine. Miss Cavendish, first name Rosalie, was Lady Eleanor's companion, a pretty young woman of perhaps 22, who had been employed at Ashworth Manor for the past 3 years. She was quiet and nervous, given to starting at sudden noises and blushing when spoken to directly. Her position in the household was ambiguous. More than a servant, but less than family, she existed in that uncomfortable liminal space that often bred resentment or inappropriate attachments. She had been devoted to Sir Edmund, the servants whispered, perhaps too devoted for propriety. Dr. Marcus Webb was the family physician, a young man of 35 who had attended Sir Edmund during his final illness and who had signed the death certificate, attributing his demise to heart failure. He had been invited to the séance at Lady Eleanor's request, she said, to provide a scientific perspective on whatever phenomena might occur. But Poirot had noticed the way Dr. Webb watched Lady Eleanor, with concern, certainly, but also with something deeper. Love, perhaps, or its darker cousin, obsession. And finally, there was Madame Zelda herself, the medium whose theatrical performance had set the previous evening's events in motion. She had not emerged from her room since retiring after the séance, claiming exhaustion from her spiritual exertions. Whether she was genuinely recovering from the strain of channeling the dead, or merely avoiding awkward questions, remained to be seen. 6 suspects, Poirot mused, each with potential motives for wanting to torment Lady Eleanor, or, if his darker suspicions proved correct, for wanting to avenge Sir Edmund's murder. It was a manageable number, small enough to investigate thoroughly, yet large enough to provide complexity. He found himself almost grateful for the snowstorm that had trapped them all together. A detective could ask for no better laboratory than a closed circle of suspects. A knock at his door interrupted these musings. It was Fenton, the butler, a dignified man of middle years whose carefully neutral expression suggested he had seen far too much to be surprised by anything. "Breakfast is being served in the morning room, sir. Lady Eleanor asks if you would be so good as to join her when you have finished. She wishes to discuss the arrangements for your investigation." "Merci, Fenton. I shall be down directly." Poirot paused, studying the butler's face for any sign of useful information. "Tell me, how long have you been in service at Ashworth Manor?" 23 years, sir. I came as a footman when the late baronet, Sir Edmund's father, was still master." "Then you knew Sir Edmund well?" "As well as any servant knows his master, sir. Which is to say, better than the master realizes, and worse than the servant admits." It was an unexpectedly philosophical response, and Poirot filed it away for future consideration. "And these supernatural disturbances that Lady Eleanor has been experiencing, have you witnessed any of them yourself?" Fenton's neutral expression flickered, just for an instant, before reasserting itself. "I have seen things, sir. Things that I cannot explain. But I am a practical man, and I prefer to leave explanations to those better qualified than myself." A diplomatic answer. "I have found diplomacy to be essential in my profession, sir. Will there be anything else?" "Not at present, but I suspect we shall have much to discuss before this matter is concluded." Breakfast was a subdued affair, the guests picking at their eggs and toast with the distracted air of people whose minds were elsewhere. Lady Eleanor presided at the head of the table, looking pale, but composed, in a black dress that emphasized both her widowhood and her considerable beauty. She was a handsome woman in her late 30s, with dark hair, striking grey eyes, and the kind of bone structure that would retain its elegance into old age. It was easy to see why Colonel Hastings watched her so intently, or why Dr. Webb seemed unable to look away. The conversation, such as it was, centered on the snowstorm and the likelihood of its continuing. Colonel Hastings offered his opinion, frequently and at length, that they were in for at least 3 more days of confinement, based on his experiences with similar weather in the Khyber Pass. Mrs. Pemberton complained about the drafts and the inadequacy of the fires. Miss Cavendish said nothing at all, keeping her eyes fixed on her plate and her hands folded in her lap. Madame Zelda did not appear. After breakfast, Lady Eleanor led Poirot to her late husband's study, a comfortable room lined with books and hunting trophies that had clearly been a masculine sanctuary. She closed the door behind them with an air of relief, as though escaping the oppressive atmosphere of the breakfast table. "I apologize for the awkwardness, Monsieur Poirot. This household has not been harmonious since Edmund's death. There are tensions that I cannot seem to resolve, no matter what I do." "Tell me about these tensions. Tell me about the people who are staying in your house." Lady Eleanor sighed, sinking into one of the leather chairs that flanked the fireplace. "Where to begin? Colonel Hastings has been a neighbour for as long as I can remember. He and Edmund served together in the war before Edmund inherited the title. He has been very attentive since my husband's death. Too attentive, some might say. He wishes to marry you. He has not said so directly, but his intentions are clear enough. I have tried to discourage him without being unkind, but he does not seem to understand hints." She shook her head. "Or perhaps he understands and simply chooses to ignore them." "And Mrs. Pemberton, your aunt?" "Aunt Agatha came to stay 2 weeks after Edmund died. She said I needed family around me, and since I have no close relatives of my own, she appointed herself to the role. She means well, I suppose, but she watches me constantly. I sometimes feel like a prisoner in my own home." "What do you think she is watching for?" Lady Eleanor's expression became guarded. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do, madame. Your aunt is not simply offering comfort. She is monitoring your behaviour, looking for something. Signs of guilt, perhaps, or evidence of wrongdoing." "That's absurd. I have done nothing wrong." "And yet, the ghost of your husband accuses you of murder. That is a serious charge, whether it comes from the living or the dead." Lady Eleanor's composure cracked, just for a moment. "I did not kill Edmund. Whatever you heard last night, whatever anyone says, I am innocent. He died of heart failure. Dr. Webb signed the death certificate. There was no murder." "Then why does his spirit accuse you? Why does he haunt your halls and whisper in your rooms and stand at the foot of your bed with eyes full of accusation?" "I don't know!" The words came out as almost a wail. "That's why I hired Madame Zelda, why I invited you, why I am willing to submit to any investigation you care to conduct. I need to understand what is happening. I need to know the truth." Poirot studied her for a long moment, his green eyes missing nothing. The pallor of her skin, the shadows beneath her eyes, the way her hands twisted together in her lap. She was frightened, genuinely frightened. But of what? The ghost of her husband? Or the possibility that her crimes might be discovered? "Very well," he said at last. "Let us begin with the facts. Tell me about Sir Edmund's death. Everything you can remember, from the beginning of his illness to the moment he drew his last breath." Chapter 3. The Death of Sir Edmund. Lady Eleanor's account of her husband's final days was delivered in a flat, emotionless voice that suggested she had told the story many times before and had learned to detach herself from its painful details. Edmund had never been particularly robust. He suffered from a weak heart, a congenital condition, Dr. Webb said, that ran in the Ashworth family. His father died young from the same ailment, and his grandfather before him. Edmund always knew his time might be limited, and he tried to live accordingly. No excessive exertion, no strong spirits, regular rest, and moderate habits. Yet he was only 45 when he died. 46. His birthday was in March. He died in June. Lady Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. The illness came on suddenly. One morning he was perfectly well, or as well as he ever was, and by evening he was bedridden with chest pains and difficulty breathing. Dr. Webb was summoned immediately, of course. He diagnosed a severe deterioration of Edmund's heart condition and prescribed complete rest and a regimen of medications. What medications? Specific. I don't know the medical terms. Dr. Webb prepared them himself in his surgery in the village. Edmund took them 3 times daily, and for a while he seemed to improve. We even began to hope that he might recover, that the crisis had passed. But it had not. No. After about 2 weeks, Edmund took a turn for the worse. The pains returned, more severe than before. He became delirious, raving about things that made no sense. Old grievances, long-dead friends, events from his youth that I had never heard him mention before. And then, one night... Her voice caught. One night I woke to find Dr. Webb shaking me, telling me I must come quickly. By the time I reached Edmund's bedside, he was already gone. You were not with him when he died? No. I had been sitting with him all evening, but he seemed peaceful, and Dr. Webb insisted I get some rest. He promised to watch over Edmund through the night. I went to bed around midnight, and Edmund died approximately 2 hours later. So, Dr. Webb was the only person present at the moment of death? He and Miss Cavendish. Rosalie had been helping to nurse Edmund throughout his illness. She was very devoted to him. She often sat with him when I needed to rest. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Miss Cavendish was present. That is interesting. You did not mention her before. I didn't think it was relevant. She was simply helping, as she always did. Rosalie has been invaluable throughout this ordeal. I don't know how I would have managed without her. And what did Dr. Webb determine as the cause of death? Heart failure, brought on by the deterioration of Edmund's condition. It was entirely expected, given his history. The death certificate was signed, the funeral was held, and Edmund was laid to rest in the family crypt. Lady Eleanor's voice hardened. There was no suspicion of foul play, no suggestion that anything was amiss. Until the haunting began. Tell me about the haunting. When did it start, and what form did it take? The first incident occurred about a week after the funeral. I was alone in my bedroom, preparing for bed, when I heard Edmund's voice. He was calling my name, just my name, over and over, like he used to do when he wanted my attention. I thought I was imagining it at first, that grief was playing tricks on my mind. But it continued, night after night. And then, the other things started. What other things? Objects moving from their usual places, doors opening and closing by themselves, cold spots in rooms that should have been warm, and the apparitions, glimpses of Edmund in corridors and doorways, always watching me, always with that terrible, accusing look in his eyes. Lady Eleanor shuddered. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real. I consulted doctors about my mental state, wondering if I was losing my mind. But then other people began to see things too. The servants, the guests, even Aunt Agatha, who believes in nothing but her own opinions, admitted that she had heard unexplained noises in the night. And so you decided to conduct a séance. I decided to seek answers. Madame Zelda came highly recommended. Mrs. Pemberton had heard of her from friends in London. She has helped other grieving families communicate with their departed loved ones, or so I was told. I thought perhaps, if I could speak to Edmund directly, I could understand why he won't leave me in peace. And instead, his spirit accused you of murder, which I did not commit. Lady Eleanor's voice was fierce. I loved Edmund. Yes, our marriage had its difficulties. All marriages do. But I would never have harmed him. The suggestion is monstrous. Poirot was silent for a moment, considering what he had heard. The story was plausible enough on its surface. A man with a weak heart succumbs to his condition, and his grieving widow begins to experience symptoms of psychological distress that manifest as supernatural phenomena. It was a pattern he had seen before, in other cases where guilt or unresolved emotion created experiences that seemed to defy natural explanation. But there were elements that troubled him. The presence of Dr. Webb at the deathbed, alone, or nearly so, with no family member to witness the final moments. The devoted Miss Cavendish, whose relationship with the deceased seemed to exceed the normal boundaries of employer and companion. The watchful Aunt Agatha, who had appeared so conveniently after the death and who seemed to be looking for evidence of wrongdoing. And the voice from the séance, that terrible, accusing voice that had spoken words of murder in a room full of witnesses. Lady Eleanor, Poirot said at last, I must ask you a question, and I must ask you to answer honestly. Were there any difficulties in your marriage? Any reasons why someone might believe you wished your husband harm? The silence that followed was answer enough. Lady Eleanor's face went through a series of expressions: shock, denial, calculation, and finally, a weary resignation that suggested she had been expecting this question and dreading it in equal measure. There were rumours, she said slowly, about Edmund and other women. He was not always faithful, and I was not always blind to his infidelities. We quarrelled about it, sometimes loudly enough for the servants to hear. I suppose some people might have thought I had reason to want him dead. And did you? Want him dead? Lady Eleanor laughed bitterly. There were moments, Monsieur Poirot, dark moments, in the worst of our quarrels, when I wished him gone. But wishing and doing are very different things. I never raised a hand against Edmund. I never put poison in his food, or smothered him with a pillow, or did any of the terrible things that widows in novels do to rid themselves of inconvenient husbands. He died of natural causes, as Dr. Webb will confirm, and my conscience is clear. And yet you are haunted. Yes, and I cannot explain it. All I know is that something is happening in this house. Something that is making my life unbearable. I need to understand what it is, and I need it to stop. That is why I have asked for your help, Monsieur Poirot. That is why I am willing to submit to whatever investigation you deem necessary. Find out the truth, whatever it may be. I would rather know the worst than continue living in this nightmare of uncertainty. Poirot rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered grounds that stretched away toward a line of dark trees in the distance. Somewhere out there, in the family crypt, lay the body of Sir Edmund Ashworth. The dead man whose ghost accused his widow of murder, whose spirit refused to rest, whose voice had filled that darkened séance room with words of condemnation. I shall conduct my investigation, Poirot said. I shall interview everyone in this household, examine every room in this house, and explore every possible explanation for what has been occurring. But I warn you, Lady Eleanor, I am not interested in reassurance or comfort. I am interested only in the truth. And if that truth proves to be unpleasant, I shall not hesitate to reveal it. I would expect nothing less from Hercule Poirot. Good. Then let us begin. I should like to start by speaking with Dr. Webb, the man who attended your husband's death and signed his death certificate. I have some questions about the nature of Sir Edmund's illness and the treatments he received. Chapter 4. The Doctor's Testimony. Dr. Marcus Webb received Poirot in the Manor's small morning room, which had been designated for the detective's use during his investigation. The young physician appeared nervous but cooperative, his intelligent brown eyes meeting Poirot's gaze with only occasional flickers of uncertainty. "I understand you wish to ask me about Sir Edmund's death," Dr. Webb said, settling into the chair Poirot indicated. "I shall be happy to tell you whatever I can, though I confess I don't understand what bearing it has on these supernatural disturbances Lady Eleanor has been experiencing." "Perhaps none at all, but I have found that in cases such as this, a thorough understanding of the underlying circumstances often illuminates paths that would otherwise remain hidden." Poirot steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "Tell me, Doctor, what was your professional opinion of Sir Edmund's health?" "He suffered from a congenital cardiac condition that had been present since childhood. The Ashworth family has a history of weak hearts. 3 of the past 5 baronets have died before the age of 50 from related causes. Sir Edmund was aware of this, and he took reasonable precautions to manage his condition. He avoided excessive physical exertion, maintained a moderate diet, and abstained from tobacco and strong spirits. Yet he died at 46. The condition was progressive. Over the years I treated him, I observed a gradual deterioration in his cardiac function. The acute episode that ultimately claimed his life was sudden in its onset, but not unexpected in its occurrence. These cases often follow that pattern, long periods of relative stability punctuated by sudden crises." "You treated Sir Edmund for many years?" "Since I established my practice in the village, about 6 years ago. I inherited many of my patients from old Dr. Harrington, who retired due to his own health issues. Sir Edmund was among them." "And the medications you prescribed during his final illness, what were they?" Dr. Webb's expression became slightly guarded. "A combination of digitalis for the heart and various sedatives to manage his pain and anxiety. The standard treatment for cases of this type." "Digitalis." Poirot repeated the word thoughtfully. "That is a powerful drug, is it not? Derived from the foxglove plant. Beneficial in proper doses, but potentially dangerous if administered incorrectly." "Like many medications, yes. But I assure you, I followed proper protocols in preparing and administering Sir Edmund's treatments. The doses were carefully calibrated to his weight and condition, and I personally supervised each administration." "Each administration? You were present every time Sir Edmund took his medication?" "For the most part, yes. During the acute phase of his illness, I visited Ashworth Manor daily, sometimes twice daily. I prepared the doses myself and watched him take them." "And when you were not present?" "Lady Eleanor or Miss Cavendish administered the medications according to my instructions. They were both quite capable. I had no concerns about their ability to follow directions." Poirot made a mental note of this. So the medications had passed through several hands before reaching the patient. The doctor who prepared them, the wife who administered them, the companion who assisted in his care. any one of them could have tampered with the doses, could have added something extra, or adjusted the concentration to a harmful level. "Tell me about the night of Sir Edmund's death," Poirot said. "You were present, I understand." "I was. Lady Eleanor had been sitting with him all evening, but around midnight she retired to get some rest. I promised to watch over him through the night. Miss Cavendish was also present. She had been helping with the nursing duties throughout his illness." "And what happened after Lady Eleanor left?" "Sir Edmund slept for a while, peacefully enough. Around 2 o'clock, he woke and became agitated. He was having difficulty breathing, and his pulse was irregular. I administered additional medication to calm him, but he continued to deteriorate. By 2:30, it was clear that the end was near." "Did he speak? Did he say anything before he died?" Dr. Webb hesitated, his eyes flickering away from Poirot's gaze. "He was delirious. He said many things that made no sense." "Nevertheless, I should like to hear them." "He spoke of his father, who died when Edmund was a young man. He mentioned names I didn't recognize, old friends perhaps, or business associates. And he—" The doctor paused again, clearly uncomfortable. "He spoke of Lady Eleanor." "What did he say?" "He called her name several times, and once, near the end, he said something that I have never forgotten. He said, 'She did this to me. Eleanor did this. God forgive her.'" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Poirot's expression remained neutral, but his grey cells were working furiously. "You are telling me that Sir Edmund accused his wife of causing his death?" "I am telling you what he said. Whether it was the delirium speaking or some deeper truth, I cannot say. He was not in his right mind at that point. The medications, the pain, the approach of death itself all contribute to confusion and hallucination. I did not take his words literally." "But you remembered them." "How could I not? They were virtually his last words. He died less than 10 minutes later, with that accusation still on his lips." Dr. Webb's face was troubled. "I have thought about it many times since, wondered if I should have reported it to someone, wondered if there was something I missed in my diagnosis. But I examined Sir Edmund thoroughly, both before and after his death. There was no sign of foul play, no evidence of poisoning or violence. He died of heart failure, as I stated on the death certificate. Whatever he believed in his final moments, I am confident that his death was natural." "And yet you are troubled." "Wouldn't you be? A man accuses his wife of murder with his dying breath, and 6 months later, his ghost is making the same accusation from beyond the grave. I am a man of science, Monsieur Poirot. I do not believe in spirits or supernatural phenomena, but I cannot deny that the coincidence is disturbing." "More than a coincidence, perhaps." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the doctor's face. "Tell me, Dr. Webb, what do you believe happened here last night? What do you think we witnessed at that séance?" "I think we witnessed an elaborate performance by a skilled charlatan. Madame Zelda is clearly accomplished at her craft. The theatrical effects, the voice, the timing were all impeccable. But I do not believe for a moment that Sir Edmund's spirit actually spoke to us. Someone produced those effects through trickery, for reasons I cannot fathom." And the accusation of murder? The voice claiming that Lady Eleanor killed her husband? A cruel manipulation, designed to frighten and destabilize her. Lady Eleanor has been under tremendous strain since Edmund's death. The haunting, the whispers, the constant sense of being watched. Someone is deliberately tormenting her, and last night's séance was simply the latest and most dramatic example. You believe someone is deliberately staging these supernatural events? I believe it is the only rational explanation. Ghosts do not exist, Monsieur Poirot. Dead men do not speak. Whatever is happening in this house, it has a human agency behind it. A human mind, human hands, human motives. Find that person, and you will have solved your mystery. And who do you believe that person to be? Dr. Webb was silent for a long moment, his expression conflicted. I have my suspicions, he said at last, but I would prefer not to voice them without evidence. I have seen what accusations can do to innocent people, and I will not contribute to that harm. A commendable discretion. But I would remind you, Doctor, that withholding relevant information from an investigation can have consequences of its own. If you know something, or suspect something, that might help me identify the person responsible for these events, I urge you to share it. I will consider your words, Monsieur Poirot. But for now, I have told you everything I know with certainty. The rest is merely speculation, and speculation is not evidence. The interview concluded, but Poirot sat for a long while afterward, thinking about what he had heard. Dr. Webb was hiding something. Of that he was certain. The doctor's nervousness, his careful choice of words, the way his eyes had flickered away at crucial moments, all of it suggested a man with secrets he was not yet ready to reveal. But what secrets? Had he been complicit in Sir Edmund's death, perhaps adjusting the medications to hasten his end? Was he protecting Lady Eleanor, concealing evidence that might implicate her in murder? Or was he himself the architect of the haunting, using his medical knowledge to create effects that would terrify and manipulate? The questions multiplied, but the answers remained elusive. Poirot would need more information before he could untangle this web of deception. More interviews, more observations, more opportunities for the guilty party to reveal themselves through word or deed. And he had a feeling that the mystery of the haunted widow was far more complex than anyone yet realized. Chapter 5. The Companion's Secret. Miss Rosalie Cavendish was waiting for Poirot in the conservatory, a glass-walled room at the back of the manor that overlooked the snow-covered gardens. She sat very still on a wrought-iron bench, her hands folded in her lap, her pale face turned toward the falling snow with an expression of profound melancholy. She was, Poirot observed, quite beautiful in an understated way. Fair hair, delicate features, and large blue eyes that seemed perpetually on the verge of tears. She was dressed in a simple grey dress that matched her subdued manner, and she wore no jewellery except for a small silver locket that hung around her neck on a thin chain. Miss Cavendish. Poirot seated himself across from her on another bench. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I could hardly refuse, could I? You're conducting an investigation. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, and she did not meet his eyes. Lady Eleanor said we must all cooperate. Indeed, and I hope you will be candid with me, mademoiselle. I sense that you know things about this household that others might prefer to keep hidden. She looked up at that, startled.
I don't know what you mean.
I mean that you were present at Sir Edmund's deathbed. You heard his final words, his accusation against his wife. And you have been living in this house for 3 years, observing its inhabitants, witnessing their secrets and conflicts. You know more than you pretend.
I know nothing. I'm just a companion. A servant, really. No one tells me anything important.
And yet Sir Edmund confided in you. According to Dr. Webb, you sat with him often during his final illness, sometimes for hours at a time. A dying man, alone with a sympathetic young woman. Surely he spoke to you of things he might not have shared with others. Miss Cavendish's cheeks flushed pink.
He was delirious much of the time. He spoke of his childhood, his parents, his years in the army. Nothing coherent, nothing significant.
And of his marriage? His relationship with Lady Eleanor? The flush deepened.
I don't think I should discuss that.
Because it would be disloyal to your employer? Or because you have feelings about the matter that you would prefer not to reveal? The young woman's composure finally cracked.
What are you suggesting? What do you think you know about me?
I know that you were devoted to Sir Edmund, perhaps more devoted than propriety would allow. I know that you were present when he died, that you heard him accuse his wife of murder, and that you have said nothing about it to anyone. I know that you wear a locket around your neck, a locket that almost certainly contains a keepsake connected to the deceased. And I know that when I mentioned Sir Edmund's name just now, your hand moved unconsciously to touch that locket, as though seeking comfort or connection. Miss Cavendish's hand flew away from the locket, as though it had been burned.
You see too much, Monsieur Poirot.
I see only what is there to be seen, mademoiselle. The question is, what you will choose to tell me about it. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sound of snow falling against the glass walls of the conservatory. Finally, Miss Cavendish spoke, her voice barely audible.
I loved him. Is that what you want me to say?
I loved Sir Edmund, and I believe he cared for me too, in his way. Nothing improper ever happened between us. But there was an understanding, a connection, and when he died, her voice broke. When he died, a part of me died with him. Did Lady Eleanor know of your feelings? I don't think so. I was careful to conceal them, and Edmund was discreet. He never showed me any special attention when others were present. But in private, when we were alone, he would talk to me as he never talked to his wife. He told me about his unhappiness, his loneliness, his sense that he had wasted his life on a marriage that had never truly been a partnership. He was unhappy in his marriage, deeply unhappy. Lady Eleanor was cold to him, dismissive of his concerns, always too busy with her social engagements and charitable works to pay attention to his needs. He felt neglected, unloved, trapped in a union that had long since lost whatever affection it once possessed. And his infidelities? The rumours of other women? Miss Cavendish's expression hardened. Whatever Edmund did, he did because his wife drove him to it. She showed him no warmth, no compassion, no understanding. Is it any wonder he sought comfort elsewhere? You defend him most passionately, mademoiselle, because he deserved to be defended. He was a good man, a kind man, and he deserved better than the cold, loveless existence his wife gave him. And now she has the audacity to play the grieving widow, to arrange séances and summon mediums, to pretend she cares about his spirit when she never cared about him when he was alive. Bitterness had crept into Miss Cavendish's voice, transforming her from a meek companion into something sharper and more dangerous. It makes me sick to watch it. Do you believe she killed him? The question hung in the air between them. Miss Cavendish's eyes met Poirot's for the first time since the interview began, and what he saw there gave him pause. There was hatred in those eyes, deep, burning hatred that had been carefully concealed beneath a mask of submissive compliance. "I believe she destroyed him," Miss Cavendish said quietly. "Whether she used poison or neglect, or simply the slow erosion of a loveless marriage, she killed him just the same. His heart was weak, yes, but it was her coldness that finally broke it. She is guilty, Monsieur Poirot. The ghost knows it. And now, perhaps, you know it too." "The ghost." Poirot repeated the word thoughtfully. "You believe in the ghost, then? You believe Sir Edmund's spirit is actually haunting this house?" "I believe that the dead do not rest easily when they have been wronged. Edmund was wronged. By his wife, by his fate, by the universe that gave him a weak heart and a cold marriage, and a life that never measured up to his dreams. If his spirit walks these halls seeking justice, I say he has earned the right." "And the séance last night? The voice that accused Lady Eleanor of murder?" "I heard what everyone heard. A voice from beyond the grave, speaking truths that the living refuse to acknowledge." Miss Cavendish's lips curved into something that was almost a smile. "Perhaps the dead are more honest than the living, Monsieur Poirot. Perhaps they have nothing left to lose by telling the truth." The interview concluded shortly afterward, leaving Poirot with much to consider. Miss Cavendish had been more forthcoming than he had expected, but her very openness raised questions. Was she genuinely convinced of Lady Eleanor's guilt? Or was she using the supernatural events to pursue some agenda of her own? Had her love for Sir Edmund been as innocent as she claimed? Or had there been more between them than she was willing to admit? And most troubling of all, Miss Cavendish had been present at the séance, present at the deathbed, present throughout the months of haunting. She had opportunity, motive, and, if her hatred of Lady Eleanor was any indication, the emotional drive to orchestrate exactly the kind of psychological torment the widow had been experiencing. The companion, Poirot realized, had just become his most intriguing suspect. Chapter 6. The Medium's Secret. Madame Zelda finally emerged from her room late that afternoon, looking pale and drawn, but dressed with her customary theatrical flair. She had exchanged her séance robes for a more conventional outfit, though it was still dramatic by any ordinary standard. A dress of deep burgundy velvet with elaborate embroidery, paired with heavy silver jewellery that clinked softly as she moved. She received Poirot in the small parlour that had been assigned to her use, reclining on a chaise longue with an air of exhausted spirituality that seemed calculated to impress. "Monsieur Poirot, the famous detective." Her voice was low and throaty, with an accent that might have been continental, but was more likely an affectation. "I have heard much about you. They say you do not believe in the supernatural." "I believe in evidence, madame. And evidence, in my experience, invariably points to natural explanations, however extraordinary those explanations may seem." "How limiting. The world is so much larger than the things we can see and measure. There are forces at work in this house, Monsieur Poirot. Forces that cannot be explained by your evidence and your logic. Perhaps. Or perhaps those forces have entirely human origins. Poirot seated himself across from her, his posture erect and alert despite his comfortable surroundings. I should like to discuss what happened at the séance last night. The effects were most impressive. The sudden darkness, the drop in temperature, the voice that spoke of murder. I am curious about the methods you employed. Madame Zelda's expression became affronted.
Methods? You suggest that I employed trickery?
I suggest nothing. I merely observe that séances often involve theatrical techniques designed to enhance the experience for participants. Speaking tubes, confederates, ventriloquism. These are well-documented practices in the spiritualist community. I wonder which of them you favour.
I favour none of them, monsieur. What happened last night was genuine spiritual communication. Sir Edmund Ashworth's ghost chose to speak through me, to deliver a message to his widow that she needed to hear. I was merely the vessel, the conduit through which his spirit could make itself known.
And the accusation of murder? The voice claiming that Lady Eleanor killed her husband. Was that also a message from beyond the grave?
I can only report what I experienced. When the spirit entered me, I lost consciousness of my own identity. I do not remember speaking any words or making any accusations. I only remember the cold, the darkness, and the overwhelming presence of something, someone who had crossed over from the realm of the dead.
Poirot studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. Madame Zelda was clearly a skilled performer. Her expressions, her gestures, her voice, all seemed perfectly calibrated to create an impression of mystical authority. But whether she was a genuine believer in her own abilities, or a cynical fraud exploiting the grief of vulnerable clients, he could not yet determine. Tell me about yourself, madame. How did you come to be a medium? What brought you to this profession?
It is not a profession, monsieur. It is a calling. I discovered my abilities as a child.
Growing up in a small village in Hungary, I saw things that others could not see, heard voices that others could not hear. My grandmother was also gifted. She taught me to control my abilities, to use them in service of those who needed to communicate with loved ones who had passed on. Hungary? And yet, your accent suggests something rather more English, shall we say? Madame Zelda's composure flickered, just for an instant. I have lived in England for many years. One's accent naturally adapts. Of course. And your name, Zelda. It is not a Hungarian name, is it? It is the name given to me by the spirits when I first awakened to my abilities. My birth name is of no importance. I am Madame Zelda now, and I have been for many years. I see. Poirot let the silence stretch, watching as Madame Zelda's self-assured expression gradually became uncertain. It is curious, though. When I contacted my colleagues in London this morning, before the telephone lines went down, I asked them to make some inquiries about you. They reported that a woman calling herself Madame Zelda has been conducting séances in the home counties for approximately 5 years. Before that, she was known by several other names. Madame Mystery, the Seer of Stepney, Lady Luna of the Lunar Circle. And before that, he paused, watching her face carefully. Before that, she was Edith Blanche Simpkins of Clapham, a former music hall performer who was convicted of fraud in 1922 and served 18 months in Holloway Prison for running a confidence scheme that targeted grieving widows. The transformation was remarkable. Madame Zelda's mystical composure crumbled like a sandcastle before the tide, replaced by the hard-eyed wariness of a woman who had been caught before and knew what the consequences might be.
"That was a long time ago,"
she said, her accent now unmistakably English.
"I've gone straight since then. The séances are legitimate. I don't steal from my clients or make promises I can't keep."
People want comfort, and I give them comfort. There's nothing criminal in that. Perhaps not. But it does cast doubt on your claims of genuine spiritual ability. A convicted fraudster who suddenly discovers she can communicate with the dead, it strains credulity, does it not? I don't care what you believe about my abilities. They're real, whether you accept them or not. What happened last night? She stopped, seeming to reconsider her words. What happened last night was different. Something actually came through. Something I didn't control, didn't expect, didn't summon. That voice, those words, they weren't part of my usual routine. They scared me as much as they scared anyone else in that room. You are saying that the voice was not your doing, that you did not produce it through ventriloquism or some other technique. I'm saying I don't know where it came from. One moment I was doing my usual act, the trance, the dramatic pronouncements, the spiritual atmosphere, and the next moment, something else took over. Something cold and angry and determined to be heard. Edith, for that was clearly her true identity, shuddered. I've been doing this for years, Monsieur Poirot, and I've never experienced anything like it. Whatever spoke through me last night, it wasn't a trick. It was real. Real in what sense? You believe it was actually the ghost of Sir Edmund Ashworth? I believe it was something that wanted to accuse Lady Eleanor, something that wanted the truth to come out. She met his eyes with an expression that seemed, for the first time, entirely sincere. I'm a fraud, Monsieur Poirot. I won't deny it. But even frauds can occasionally encounter the genuine article. And I'm telling you, whatever happened in that room last night was beyond anything I could have produced myself. Poirot considered this for a long moment. Either Madame Zelda, Edith Simpkins, was a more sophisticated deceiver than he had given her credit for, or something truly unusual had occurred at the séance. The possibility that she was telling the truth about her own surprise was worth considering, even if he remained skeptical about the supernatural explanation she was suggesting. Let us say, for the sake of argument, that you did not produce the voice yourself, he said. Then someone else in that room must have done so. The effects were too sophisticated to have been produced by accident or coincidence. Someone created the darkness, the cold, the voice that accused Lady Eleanor. If not you, then who? Edith's expression became calculating. I've been thinking about that all night, and I can only think of one person who had both the opportunity and the knowledge to pull off something like that. Who? The person who hired me. The person who arranged for me to come to Ashworth Manor, who told me exactly what to say and how to say it, who coached me on the family history and the circumstances of Sir Edmund's death, the person who wanted Lady Eleanor frightened and destabilized, who wanted that accusation of murder to be heard by everyone in the room. And who was this person? Edith smiled grimly. Mrs. Pemberton, Lady Eleanor's own aunt. She's the one who brought me here, Monsieur Poirot. She's the one who wanted the haunting to happen. Chapter 7. The Aunt's Agenda. The revelation about Mrs. Pemberton sent Poirot's investigation in an entirely new direction. He found the elderly woman in the library, where she sat enthroned in a high-backed chair near the fire, reading a book with an expression of sour disapproval that seemed to be her permanent state. She looked up as Poirot entered, her sharp eyes assessing him with undisguised suspicion. The detective. Come to ask more questions, I suppose. Well, get on with it. I don't have all day. Indeed, madame. I shall try not to take too much of your time. Poirot seated himself across from her, without waiting for an invitation. I have been speaking with Madame Zelda, or should I say Miss Edith Simpkins of Clapham. She has made some rather interesting allegations about you. Mrs. Pemberton's expression did not change. Has she? And what has that common fraud been saying? She claims that you are the one who hired her, that you arranged for her to come to Ashworth Manor and conduct the séance, that you coached her on what to say and how to behave. In short, that you are the architect of the haunting that has been tormenting your niece. For a long moment, Mrs. Pemberton said nothing. Then, slowly, a thin smile spread across her weathered face. The woman is cleverer than I gave her credit for. I thought I had chosen a puppet who would follow instructions without understanding them. It seems I underestimated her. Then you admit it? You hired Madame Zelda to conduct the séance? I admit that I brought her here and told her what to do, but I did not create last night's display. That was entirely beyond my expectations. I wanted Eleanor frightened, yes. I wanted her to believe that Edmund's ghost was watching her, judging her. But the accusation of murder... Mrs. Pemberton's smile faded. That was not part of my plan. Why? Why would you want to frighten your own niece? Because she is a murderess, Monsieur Poirot. Because she killed my nephew Edmund, as surely as if she had put a bullet through his heart. And because I could not prove it through legal means, so I chose another approach. Poirot felt his grey cells suddenly click into a new configuration, old assumptions giving way to new possibilities. You believe Lady Eleanor murdered her husband? I know she did. I have known since the day he died, since I arrived at this house and saw the way she was behaving. Not like a grieving widow, but like a woman who had been relieved of a burden. Oh, she played the part well enough for the servants and the neighbours. But I knew her when she was a girl, before she married Edmund. I knew what she was capable of. What was she capable of? Manipulation, deception, the ruthless pursuit of her own interests at the expense of anyone who stood in her way. Mrs. Pemberton's voice was bitter with years of accumulated resentment. Eleanor trapped Edmund into marriage, you know. She pursued him relentlessly, even though she knew his health was fragile, even though she knew the Ashworth fortune was not as substantial as it appeared. She wanted to be Lady Ashworth, wanted the title and the house and the social position. And when she got them, when she discovered that Edmund was not the prize she had hoped for, she began to look for a way out. A way out that included murder. What other way out was there? Divorce would have been scandalous, and Edmund would never have agreed to it anyway. He loved her, despite everything, despite her coldness, her indifference, her obvious contempt for him. He would have stayed with her until the end of his days. Mrs. Pemberton's eyes glittered with unshed tears. So she made sure those days ended sooner rather than later. How? Dr. Webb examined him thoroughly, and found no evidence of poisoning. Because she was clever about it. She didn't use poison, at least not in the traditional sense. She used neglect. Deliberate, calculated neglect, designed to worsen his condition and hasten his death. She ignored his symptoms when they first appeared, refused to call the doctor until it was almost too late, and then, during his final illness, she made sure he received just enough treatment to appear like a loving wife, while not enough to actually save him. That is a serious accusation, madame. What evidence do you have? I have the evidence of my own observations. I arrived at this house 2 weeks after Edmund died, and I have been watching Eleanor ever since. The relief in her eyes when she thinks no one is looking. The way she has already begun spending his money on frivolous things. The casual mentions of starting a new life and moving forward that a genuinely grieving widow would never make so soon after her loss. These are observations, madam, not evidence. They prove nothing except that Lady Eleanor may be handling her grief in ways you find inappropriate. Then there is the matter of the will. Mrs. Pemberton leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Edmund made a new will 2 months before his death, cutting Eleanor off almost entirely. He left the bulk of his estate to his cousins, with only a small annuity for his widow. But Eleanor somehow convinced him to destroy that will and reinstate the original, which leaves everything to her. How do you explain that, Monsieur Poirot? A dying man, changing his will at his wife's urging, restoring her as his primary beneficiary just weeks before he expires? This was new information, and Poirot filed it away with growing interest. A changed will. A dying husband. A wife with everything to gain from his death. These were the classic elements of a murder case, even if the mechanism of the murder remained unclear. You have given me much to think about, madame. But I must ask, if you believed Lady Eleanor guilty of murder, why did you not go to the police? Why resort to hiring fake mediums and staging supernatural displays? Because I have no proof that would satisfy a court of law. Everything I know, everything I suspect, is based on observation and intuition. No policeman would take me seriously. No prosecutor would bring charges based on the testimony of a bitter old woman who doesn't like her niece. Mrs. Pemberton's voice hardened. So, I decided to pursue justice in my own way. I hired Madame Zelda to make Eleanor believe she was being haunted, to create enough pressure and guilt that she might confess her crimes. I wanted her to crack, Monsieur Poirot. I wanted the mask to slip, just for a moment, so that everyone could see the murderess beneath. And last night's séance? The voice that accused Lady Eleanor. I told you, that was not my doing. I instructed Madame Zelda to create an atmosphere, to suggest that Edmund's spirit was present and unhappy. But the voice, the accusation, the specific words, those were beyond anything I planned or anticipated. Mrs. Pemberton's expression became troubled. I do not believe in ghosts, Monsieur Poirot, but something spoke through that woman last night, and it knew things it should not have known. It frightens me to consider what that might mean. It might mean that someone else is also manipulating events in this house. Someone with their own agenda, their own secrets, their own reasons for wanting Lady Eleanor to be accused of murder. Who? Who else would want such a thing? Poirot rose from his chair, his mind working through the possibilities. That is what I intend to discover. But I thank you for your candor, madame. You have confirmed several of my suspicions and raised new questions that I shall need to pursue. Will you tell Eleanor what I have done? Will you expose my scheme? I will do whatever justice requires. But I would remind you, madame, that hiring fraudulent mediums and staging fake hauntings is not a crime, merely a deception. The real question is whether there is a genuine crime at the heart of this matter, and if so, who is truly responsible for it? He left Mrs. Pemberton sitting by the fire, her face troubled, and her hands twisted together in her lap. She had given him valuable information, but she had also raised new complications. If she had not produced the voice at the séance, then someone else had. Someone with knowledge of Sir Edmund's death and a desire to see his widow accused of murder. The web of deception at Ashworth Manor was growing more tangled by the hour, and Poirot was beginning to suspect that multiple conspiracies were operating simultaneously, their threads crossing and recrossing in patterns that would require all his considerable abilities to unravel. Chapter 8. The Colonel's Confession. Colonel Hastings proved more difficult to interview than the other guests. He had spent most of the day in the billiard room, nursing a glass of whiskey and avoiding the company of his fellow snowbound captives. When Poirot finally cornered him, the military man seemed eager to talk, though whether from a desire to assist the investigation or from the simple need for human contact, Poirot could not immediately determine. "Terrible business, this," the Colonel said, gesturing vaguely at the room around him. "Poor Eleanor, being put through all this. First Edmund dies, then she's plagued by ghosts, and now she's being accused of murder by her own husband's spirit. It's enough to drive anyone mad." "You are concerned for Lady Eleanor's welfare?" "Of course I am. She's a fine woman, always has been. Edmund was lucky to have her, even if he didn't always appreciate it." The Colonel's expression softened. "I've known Eleanor for years, you know. Before she married Edmund, before she came to Ashworth Manor. We were neighbours as children. Our families' estates bordered each other in Wiltshire. I had hoped once that she might." He trailed off, but Poirot understood what he had not said. "You had feelings for her before she married Sir Edmund?" "I was in love with her. Completely, hopelessly, foolishly in love. But I was a younger son with no prospects, and she was the most beautiful girl in the county. When Edmund came along with his title and his estate, I knew I didn't stand a chance." The Colonel took a long drink of his whiskey. "I went off to India, served my king and country for 20 years, and tried to forget about her. When I retired and came back to England, I bought the estate next to Ashworth Manor, just to be near her, I suppose, even though I knew nothing could ever come of it. And now Sir Edmund is dead." The Colonel's face went still. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting nothing. But Lady Eleanor is now a widow, and you are a bachelor who has loved her for decades. You must have considered the possibility that, with time and proper mourning, she might be receptive to a renewal of your suit." "I have considered it. What man wouldn't? But I am not so base as to celebrate another man's death, or to press my attentions on a woman who is clearly in distress." The Colonel set down his glass with more force than necessary. "I came here to offer Eleanor my support, nothing more. If she ever chooses to see me as something other than an old friend, It will be her decision, made in her own time. A noble sentiment. But I wonder if your support extends to protecting her from accusations of murder. It does, because I know she is innocent, Monsieur Poirot. Eleanor is not capable of murder. She hasn't got it in her. She may be cold sometimes, and distant, and not as demonstrative as some women. But she is not a killer. You sound very certain. I am certain. I have known her for 40 years, and I have never seen her do anything truly cruel or wicked. Whatever troubles existed in her marriage, she would not have solved them through violence. Poirot studied the Colonel's face, looking for any sign of deception. What he found instead was something more complex. Genuine conviction, yes, but also a note of desperation, as though the Colonel needed to believe in Eleanor's innocence as much as he needed to breathe. "Tell me about Sir Edmund's death," Poirot said. "You were a friend of his, I understand. Did you notice anything unusual in the days or weeks before he fell ill?" The Colonel hesitated. "I noticed that he seemed troubled, preoccupied. He wasn't himself during our last few conversations. I asked him what was wrong, but he wouldn't tell me. He just said that he had made some discoveries about his family's past, and that they had upset him greatly." Discoveries about his family's past? What kind of discoveries? He didn't say specifically, but he mentioned something about old papers he had found in the attic, letters and documents from his grandfather's time, or perhaps even earlier. He said they revealed secrets that should have stayed buried, and he didn't know what to do with the knowledge. This was the first Poirot had heard of any documents, and he filed the information away with keen interest. Did anyone else know about these papers? Did Sir Edmund discuss them with his wife? I don't think so. He seemed almost afraid to talk about them, as though speaking of them might make their contents more real. The last time I saw him, a few days before he fell ill, he told me he was considering destroying them altogether. He said some things were better left unknown. But he did not destroy them. I don't know. He died before we could discuss it further. But if the papers still exist, they might be in his study, or in the attic where he found them. That is most helpful, Colonel. I shall certainly look into it. Poirot paused, considering his next question carefully. One more thing. Where were you on the night of the séance, at the moment when the voice spoke? What did you see and hear? I was standing near the windows, on the far side of the room from Lady Eleanor. When the candles went out, I couldn't see anything. It was absolute darkness. But I heard the voice clearly, and I recognized it. The Colonel's expression became haunted. It was Edmund's voice, Monsieur Poirot. I would stake my life on it. I knew that voice as well as I know my own. I had heard it countless times over the years. And whatever spoke in that room last night, it was him. Edmund's ghost returned from the dead to accuse his wife of murder. You believe in ghosts, then? I didn't before last night, but what I heard in that room, it has shaken my certainty. There are more things in heaven and earth, as the poet says, than are dreamt of in our philosophy. The Colonel shook his head slowly. I don't know what to believe anymore, Monsieur Poirot. I only know that something is very wrong in this house, and I fear for Eleanor's safety, and perhaps for my own. The interview with Colonel Hastings left Poirot more troubled than he cared to admit. The Colonel's recognition of Sir Edmund's voice was a significant piece of evidence, if genuine. But it was also possible that he had been deceived by a skilled impersonator. The human memory was notoriously unreliable, especially under conditions of stress and sensory deprivation. A voice heard in total darkness during a séance designed to create an atmosphere of supernatural terror might easily be misidentified. But the matter of the documents was more concrete. If Sir Edmund had truly discovered papers in the attic that contained family secrets, secrets disturbing enough to preoccupy him in the weeks before his death, then those papers might hold the key to understanding what was happening at Ashworth Manor. Poirot decided to search for them immediately. Chapter 9. Secrets in the Attic. The attic of Ashworth Manor was a vast, shadowy space that stretched the entire length of the house, its low ceiling supported by massive oak beams that had been in place for centuries. Dust lay thick on every surface, disturbed only by the footprints of those who had ventured here before. Footprints that Poirot studied carefully as he made his way through the accumulated debris of generations. The Ashworth family had clearly never thrown anything away. The attic was filled with furniture too worn for the main rooms, but too valuable to discard. Trunks and boxes of old clothing, portraits of ancestors too unfashionable to hang on the walls below, and shelf after shelf of documents, household accounts, personal correspondence, legal papers, and family records stretching back to the time of the Civil War. Finding a specific set of papers in this chaos would have been nearly impossible without some clue to guide him. Fortunately, the Colonel's information provided exactly such a clue. Sir Edmund had discovered the documents in the weeks before his death, which meant that someone, presumably Sir Edmund himself, had been searching through the attic recently. The disturbed dust and fresh footprints should indicate where he had been looking. Poirot followed the trail of disturbance to a corner of the attic where several old trunks had been pushed aside to reveal a smaller chest hidden behind them. The chest was old, very old, judging by its construction, and its lock had been recently forced, the hasp twisted aside with what must have been considerable effort. Inside the chest, Poirot found exactly what he had been hoping for. A bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, a leather-bound journal with the name Arthur Ashworth embossed on the cover, and several official-looking documents that appeared to be legal contracts or agreements of some kind. He carried the materials to a spot near the attic's small window, where the failing afternoon light provided just enough illumination to read, and began to examine his discoveries. The letters were correspondence between Arthur Ashworth, Sir Edmund's great-great-grandfather, and a woman named Elizabeth Hartley. The tone of the letters left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. They were love letters, passionate and intimate, written with a fervour that was both touching and faintly embarrassing to read after more than a century and a half. But it was the journal that proved most revealing. Arthur Ashworth had been a married man when he began his affair with Elizabeth Hartley, and she had been a married woman, the wife, in fact, of Arthur's closest friend and business partner. The journal documented the progress of the affair, the guilt both parties felt, and the growing impossibility of their situation. And then, in the final entries, the journal recorded something far more serious. "Elizabeth is with child," Arthur had written in an entry dated April 17, 1847. "She is certain the child is mine. The The timing makes it impossible for it to be James's. We have discussed what to do, and we have decided that the child must be born, but that no one must ever know its true parentage. Elizabeth will claim the child is James's, and I will say nothing. The secret must die with us. But the secret had not died. The journal went on to record that Elizabeth's husband, James Hartley, had discovered the truth, or at least suspected it, and had threatened to expose the affair and disinherit the child. Arthur Ashworth, faced with the ruin of both his reputation and his mistress's life, had made a terrible decision. "James Hartley is dead," read the entry dated July 3rd, 1847. "He went riding this morning and did not return. They found his body at the bottom of Raven's Gorge, his horse standing nearby. Everyone believes it was an accident, that his horse was spooked and threw him. No one suspects the truth. No one knows that I followed him that morning, that I confronted him at the edge of the gorge, that in the heat of our argument, I pushed him to his death. God forgive me for what I have done. I have murdered my closest friend to protect a secret that should never have existed. I am damned, and I deserve to be damned. But Elizabeth is safe, and the child will inherit nothing of this shame. That, at least, is something." Poirot sat back, his mind reeling from what he had read. The Ashworth family fortune, the title, the estate, the position in society, was built on the foundation of murder. Arthur Ashworth had killed his friend to conceal an affair and protect an illegitimate child. And Sir Edmund, more than a century later, had discovered the truth. No wonder he had been troubled in the weeks before his death. No wonder he had considered destroying the documents. The knowledge that his family's legacy was stained with blood would have been devastating to a man of Sir Edmund's principles. But had the knowledge also gotten him killed? Poirot gathered the documents carefully and made his way back down from the attic, his grey cells working furiously. The discovery raised new questions, even as it answered old ones. Had someone else known about these documents? Had Sir Edmund shared his discovery with anyone before his death? And most importantly, was there a connection between the century-old murder and the present-day haunting at Ashworth Manor? The answer, Poirot was beginning to suspect, lay in the genealogy of the Ashworth family. If Arthur Ashworth had fathered a child with Elizabeth Hartley, a child that had been passed off as the legitimate offspring of James Hartley, then that child's descendants might still be alive today. And if they knew the truth about their ancestry, they might have reason to feel aggrieved at the Ashworth family's continued prosperity. Prosperity built on the murder of their legitimate forefather. It was, Poirot realized, exactly the kind of motive that might drive someone to orchestrate an elaborate campaign of psychological terror against the current Lady Ashworth. Not supernatural vengeance, but very human revenge. Revenge for a crime committed more than 80 years ago, finally coming due. The question was, who among the guests at Ashworth Manor might be a descendant of Elizabeth Hartley and James Hartley? And were they content with merely frightening Lady Eleanor, or did they have more permanent forms of retribution in mind? Chapter 10. The Truth Revealed. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, each fragment slotting into position with the satisfying precision of a well-constructed mechanism. Poirot sat in his room that evening, reviewing his notes by candlelight, his grey cells working through the implications of what he had discovered. The genealogy had been the final key. After finding Arthur Ashworth's journal, Poirot had spent hours in the library, consulting Burke's Peerage and other reference works to trace the descendants of Elizabeth Hartley and the man she had claimed as her husband. The Hartley line had continued for several generations, eventually branching into multiple families with different surnames, including, as he had suspected, the Cavendish family. Miss Rosalie Cavendish was the great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Hartley's legitimate son, the one who had been passed off as James Hartley's heir, despite being fathered by Arthur Ashworth. Her grandmother, Mary Hartley Cavendish, had been the keeper of the family secret, passing down the story of how James Hartley had been murdered and his descendants cheated of their rightful inheritance. And Rosalie, nursing that grievance through generations of bitterness, had come to Ashworth Manor seeking revenge. But Poirot needed more than suspicion. He needed proof. And he needed to draw the conspirators out into the open, where their guilt could be established beyond any reasonable doubt. He spent the remainder of the afternoon conducting additional research, consulting Burke's Peerage in the library, questioning Fenton about the history of the household staff, and sending word through the servants that he wished to speak with everyone again the following morning. He also made careful preparations for what he anticipated would be a dramatic confrontation, preparations that required the assistance of Fenton and two of the more trustworthy footmen. He spent the remainder of the afternoon conducting additional research, consulting Burke's Peerage in the library, questioning Fenton about the history of the household staff, and sending word through the servants that he wished to speak with everyone again the following morning. That evening, dinner was a tense affair. The guests assembled in the dining room as usual, but there was an electric quality to the air, a sense that something was about to happen. Lady Eleanor sat at the head of the table, looking pale and drawn, her eyes constantly darting toward the shadows, as though expecting her husband's ghost to materialize at any moment. Mrs. Pemberton maintained her habitual expression of disapproval, but there was a nervous quality to her movements that suggested her confidence had been shaken. Colonel Hastings tried to make conversation, but his efforts fell flat, and the meal proceeded in uncomfortable silence. It was during the second course that the lights flickered and went out. The dining room was plunged into darkness, not the gradual dimming of a power failure, but an instantaneous blackout that left everyone momentarily blind. There were gasps of alarm, the scrape of chairs being pushed back, the clatter of cutlery dropped in surprise. And then, the voice came. The same voice that had spoken at the séance, that cold, accusing voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Eleanor, your time has come. You cannot escape justice forever." Lady Eleanor screamed. There was a sound of glass breaking, of someone falling, of chaos erupting in the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as they had gone out, the lights came back on. The scene they revealed was one of confusion. Lady Eleanor had collapsed in her chair, apparently having fainted. Miss Cavendish was on the floor, having knocked over her chair in her panic. Mrs. Pemberton stood pressed against the wall, her face white with shock. Colonel Hastings had drawn a small pistol from somewhere. Apparently, he had been carrying it throughout the evening and was pointing it wildly around the room, looking for a target that did not exist. Only Poirot remained calm. He had used the darkness to his advantage, moving silently from his position at the table to a spot near the door, where he had a clear view of everyone in the room when the lights returned. And he had noticed something that the others, in their panic, had missed. "That is enough," he said, his voice cutting through the confusion. "The game is over. I know how these effects have been produced, and I know who is responsible for them." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Poirot, who stood near the doorway with an expression of grim satisfaction. For the past several days, I have been investigating the supernatural disturbances at Ashworth Manor. I have interviewed everyone in this household, examined every room in this house, and explored every possible explanation for what has been occurring. And I have reached a conclusion. A conclusion that I shall now share with you. He began to pace slowly around the room, his eyes moving from face to face. Let us begin with what we know. Sir Edmund Ashworth died 6 months ago, ostensibly of heart failure. Since his death, his widow has been plagued by what appeared to be supernatural phenomena. Ghostly voices, moving objects, apparitions of her dead husband. These phenomena culminated in last night's séance, where a voice claiming to be Sir Edmund accused Lady Eleanor of murder. "We all heard that voice," Colonel Hastings said. "It was Edmund's voice. I would know it anywhere." "You heard a voice that sounded like Sir Edmund's. But voices can be imitated, Colonel, especially in conditions of darkness and emotional stress. What you perceived as supernatural communication was, in fact, a very clever piece of deception." "Deception by whom?" Mrs. Pemberton demanded. "By several people, actually, each with their own agenda and their own secrets to protect." Poirot stopped pacing and faced the assembled company. "Let me explain. Mrs. Pemberton, you hired Madame Zelda, a known fraud, to stage a haunting that would torment your niece. You believed that Lady Eleanor had murdered Sir Edmund, and you wanted to frighten her into confessing." Mrs. Pemberton's face went pale. "How did you—" "Madame Zelda told me. She is many things, but she is not foolish. She understood that cooperating with my investigation was preferable to being charged as an accessory to whatever crimes might be uncovered." "I did nothing wrong," Mrs. Pemberton protested. "I only wanted justice for Edmund." "You wanted revenge," Poirot corrected. "But that is a matter for later. What is important now is that your hired fraud was not responsible for the voice that spoke at the séance. The theatrical effects, the darkness, the cold, the atmosphere of spiritual presence, those were Madame Zelda's work. But the voice itself, the specific accusation of murder, came from someone else." "Who?" Lady Eleanor whispered. Poirot turned to face her. "That is what I shall explain. But first I must tell you about something I discovered in the attic of this house. Documents that Sir Edmund had found in the weeks before his death. Documents that revealed a terrible secret about the Ashworth family's past." He proceeded to summarize the contents of Arthur Ashworth's journal. The affair, the illegitimate child, the murder of James Hartley. The assembled guests listened in growing horror as the dark truth of the family's history was revealed. Sir Edmund discovered these documents and was deeply troubled by them, Poirot continued. He considered destroying them, but he hesitated, perhaps because he felt that the truth, however painful, should not be concealed. And I believe he shared his discovery with one other person, the woman he trusted most in the world. He turned to Miss Cavendish, who had risen from the floor, but remained standing against the wall, her face white as chalk. "You, mademoiselle. Sir Edmund told you about the documents, did he not? During those long hours when you sat with him during his illness, he confided in you about what he had learned." Miss Cavendish said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. "And you recognized the significance of what he had found, because you already knew part of the story. Knew it from your own family's history. Your grandmother's maiden name was Hartley, was it not? You are a descendant of Elizabeth Hartley and the man she claimed as her husband, James Hartley, which means you are also a descendant of the illegitimate child that Elizabeth bore to Arthur Ashworth, the child that was passed off as James Hartley's legitimate heir. "You can't prove that," Miss Cavendish said, but her voice was shaking. "I can prove a great deal. Your grandmother was Mary Hartley, who married a man named Cavendish and died 20 years ago. Before she died, she told you the family legend, the story of how James Hartley was murdered by his best friend, how the Hartley family was cheated of its rightful place in society, how the Ashworths built their fortune on the blood of an innocent man." "It wasn't a legend, it was the truth." "Perhaps, but that truth did not give you the right to do what you have done. You came to Ashworth Manor 3 years ago, not as an innocent companion seeking employment, but as an avenger seeking justice. You insinuated yourself into the household, gained Sir Edmund's confidence, and waited for an opportunity to strike." "I didn't. I never meant to." Miss Cavendish's composure was crumbling rapidly. "You fell in love with Sir Edmund. That was not part of your plan, but it happened nonetheless. And when he confided in you about the documents he had found, when he confirmed everything your grandmother had told you, your feelings became even more complicated. You loved him, but you also blamed his family for the destruction of yours." "He was going to make it right," Miss Cavendish whispered. "He said he would acknowledge the wrong that had been done, that he would make restitution to the Hartley descendants. But then he died, and Eleanor inherited everything." "And there was no justice after all. So you decided to take justice into your own hands. You began staging the haunting, using your intimate knowledge of the house, your access to the household routines, your understanding of Lady Eleanor's fears and vulnerabilities. You wanted to drive her mad, or at least to make her suffer as you believed your family had suffered. She deserved to suffer. She treated Edmund like dirt, ignored him, neglected him, and then she had the audacity to inherit his money and play the grieving widow. And then Mrs. Pemberton hired Madame Zelda, and you saw an opportunity you could not resist. You attended the séance, positioned yourself carefully, and when the lights went out, you used your own voice, disguised to sound like Sir Edmund's, to accuse Lady Eleanor of murder. The room had gone absolutely still. Everyone was staring at Miss Cavendish, whose face had contorted with a mixture of defiance and despair. "She did kill him," Miss Cavendish said. "Maybe not with poison, maybe not with violence, but she killed him with her coldness, her cruelty, her complete indifference to his happiness. He was dying of a broken heart long before his body gave out. I watched it happen, day after day, and I couldn't stop it. All I could do was be there for him, try to give him some small measure of the love and comfort his wife refused to provide. That may be so, but it does not excuse what you have done. The haunting, the psychological torment, the public accusation of murder, these are not justice. They are revenge, and revenge does not heal wounds. It only creates new ones." Miss Cavendish began to weep. "I just wanted someone to pay. I wanted the world to know what the Ashworths had done, not just to Edmund, but to my family, generations ago. They murdered James Hartley and stole his legacy. They lived in luxury while his descendants struggled in obscurity. And when Edmund finally discovered the truth, when he finally had the chance to make amends, he died before he could do anything about it. Poirot's expression softened slightly. "I understand your pain, mademoiselle. But Sir Edmund's death was not Lady Eleanor's fault. It was the result of a congenital condition that had plagued the Ashworth family for generations. A condition, incidentally, that may itself be connected to the illegitimacy in the family line. The weak heart that killed Sir Edmund was not caused by his wife's coldness. It was an inheritance from Arthur Ashworth, passed down through the generations like a curse." "A curse?" Miss Cavendish repeated bitterly. "Yes, I suppose that's what it was. A curse on the Ashworth family for what Arthur did to James Hartley. And now I've become part of it. Another victim of the same evil that has haunted this family for over 80 years. The aftermath of the revelation was a complicated and emotionally exhausting affair that continued well into the night. Miss Cavendish was taken into custody by the local constable, who had finally managed to reach Ashworth Manor once the roads began to clear. She would face charges for her role in the psychological harassment of Lady Eleanor, though the penalties were likely to be relatively minor given the circumstances. Mrs. Pemberton was also questioned about her hiring of Madame Zelda, but no charges were ultimately filed. Her scheme had been foolish and cruel, but not technically criminal, and her motivations, however misguided, had stemmed from genuine concern for her nephew's memory. Madame Zelda, Edith Simpkins, quietly departed Ashworth Manor as soon as the roads permitted, presumably to reinvent herself yet again under some new name and in some new location. Poirot suspected he had not seen the last of her, but that was a matter for another day. Lady Eleanor was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She was not guilty of murder, Poirot was certain of that now, but she was not entirely innocent either. Her coldness towards Sir Edmund, her emotional neglect of their marriage, had contributed to his unhappiness, even if they had not directly caused his death. The guilt she felt, the haunting she had experienced, were in some sense the manifestations of her own conscience, made worse by the manipulations of others, but rooted in her own awareness of how she had failed her husband. Colonel Hastings remained at Ashworth Manor for several more days, offering his support to Lady Eleanor during the difficult period that followed. Whether that support would eventually develop into something more romantic, Poirot could not say. But he noticed the way Lady Eleanor's eyes softened when she looked at the Colonel, and he suspected that time might heal wounds that seemed permanent in the immediate aftermath of tragedy. On the morning of his departure, Poirot stood in the entrance hall of Ashworth Manor, his bags packed and a motor car waiting to take him to the station. Lady Eleanor had come to see him off, looking tired, but somehow more at peace than she had been since his arrival. "I don't know how to thank you, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "You have given me the truth, even though that truth was painful. And you have freed me from the haunting that was destroying my life." "The haunting was never supernatural, madame. It was merely the work of ordinary human beings, driven by grief and anger and the desire for justice, however misguided that desire may have been." "But the voice, Miss Cavendish's voice, pretending to be Edmund, it felt so real. For a moment, in the darkness, I truly believed he had come back to accuse me." "Guilt is a powerful thing, Lady Eleanor. It can make us see and hear things that are not there, can convince us that we deserve punishment
even when we have done nothing technically wrong. Your guilt over your marriage, your awareness of how you had failed your husband, these things made you vulnerable to the deception that Miss Cavendish and the others created.
Lady Eleanor nodded slowly. I was not a good wife. I know that now. I was too caught up in my own concerns, too indifferent to Edmund's needs. If I had been different, if I had shown him more love and attention, he might still have died, madame. The heart condition was genetic, progressive, ultimately fatal. Nothing you could have done would have changed that. But you could have made his final years happier than they were. That is the true burden you must carry. Not murder, but neglect. Not a crime, but a failure of compassion. Is there any way to make amends? Any way to honor his memory now that he is gone? There is always a way to make amends. The documents Sir Edmund found in the attic, the proof of the Ashworth family's original sin, they offer you an opportunity. The Hartley descendants still exist. Miss Cavendish is one of them, but there may be others. You could seek them out, acknowledge the wrong that was done to their ancestor, make some form of restitution. It would not undo the past, but it might help to heal the wounds that have festered for so long. Lady Eleanor considered this for a moment, then nodded. Yes, I think that is what Edmund would have wanted. He was troubled by those documents, you know. Troubled by the knowledge of what his ancestor had done. He wanted to make it right. I can do that for him now. I can finish what he started. Then his death will not have been entirely in vain, and perhaps his spirit, if such things exist, will finally be at rest. Poirot took his leave of Ashworth Manor and settled into the motor car that would carry him back to civilization. As the vehicle made its way down the long drive, he looked back at the Gothic pile rising against the grey winter sky, its towers and gables stark against the clouds. The mystery of the haunted widow was solved. The truth had been revealed, the guilty identified, the innocent cleared. But as always in cases such as this, the truth had brought pain as well as clarity. The ghosts of Ashworth Manor, both real and imagined, would take time to fade, and the wounds they had inflicted would take even longer to heal. Such was the nature of justice, Poirot reflected, as the countryside rolled past the motorcar's windows. It was never clean, never simple, never without cost to both the guilty and the innocent. But it was necessary nonetheless, as necessary as breath, as essential as truth itself. Without truth, there could be no healing. Without justice, there could be no peace. And without the willingness to confront the darkness of the past, there could be no hope for a brighter future. The motorcar reached the main road and turned toward the station, leaving Ashworth Manor and its troubled inhabitants behind at last. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the snow-covered fields and frozen hedgerows, the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting its pale light over the snow-covered landscape like a benediction, or perhaps like a promise that spring would come again, bringing renewal and hope even to places that had known only darkness and despair for far too long. Thank you for joining us on The Little Grey Cells for Hercule Poirot and the Mystery of the Haunted Widow. If this tale of spectral deception and mortal guilt captured your imagination, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Was Miss Cavendish justified in her quest for revenge against the Ashworth family? Should Lady Eleanor have faced consequences for her emotional neglect of Sir Edmund? And what do you think became of the relationship between Lady Eleanor and Colonel Hastings after Poirot's departure? We love hearing from fellow mystery enthusiasts, and your engagement helps us bring more tales of the little Belgian detective to life. Until next time, keep those grey cells active. Remember that the truth, however painful, is always preferable to comfortable lies, and trust that justice, though sometimes delayed by generations, will eventually find its way to the light. Sleep well, and we'll see you in the next mystery.